another discipline became involved in the study of folklore, and that is kind of a disappearing version of science that used to appear pretty often back in the day, but that has been slowly replaced by what we today would be considered modern science. A good example of the way in which our science has evolved would be, for example, this account for the history of the kings of Britain that was published in the 12th century by Geoffrey de Monmouth, or of Monmouth. Back in the day, England was a very different place. Of course, science was a very different place. The world was completely different, and this account tells us of what Britain was like in ancient history, even before his own time. At the time, the name of the island was Albion, and of none was it inhabited, save only of a few giants. Nevertheless, the pleasant aspect of the land, with the abundance of fish in the rivers and the deer in the choice forests thereof, did fill Brute and his companions with no small desire that they should dwell therein. Therefore, after exploring certain districts of the land, they drove the giants they found to take refuge in the caverns of the mountains, and divided the country among them by lot, according as the Duke made grant thereof. So, according to this particular historical document, England, Great Britain, was inhabited by giants until this Brute person, Brutus from Latin, came in and drove the giants away and replaced that with the modern inhabitants of Britain, who are apparently, according to this story, descendants of the Romans. So obviously, the story here tells us about a group of people who existed and describes those people as giants. Is this true? Who's to say? Perhaps in some world, in some vision, maybe in some way, this is poetically true, but we have no record of any kind of giant people living there. But again, they were driven away. So maybe they went all collectively into a different place, dug up their old skeletons, and left for the Romans to inhabit there. Who's to say? History has changed, of course, as a practice, and today, to make sense out of this, we would have to look back at our historical record, our archaeological record, at what we know about the world, and it would be pretty easy to make sense out of what this means more as a fantasy story than an actual historical record. But this history book here was trusted well into the 16th century as a form of realistic story of the people of Britain. We don't have any other record of what life would have been like, and this particular record, made by a person who was apparently trustworthy, would be a good example of this story. Now, of course, the 16th and 17th century eventually becomes a little bit more accurate with their historical record, and such type of oddities, you could say, became part of a different mode of study. And the people who were interested in the ancient form of history at a time when archaeology did not exist the way that it exists today, became interested in what were called antiques. And this book here by Francis Bacon, dated from 1605, provides us a dictionary of the English language at a time when there were no dictionaries. And as part of the definitions given in this dictionary, there are antiques that are considered as grotesque figures. Compare in Shakespeare, Much Ado About Nothing, if black, why nature drawing as an antique made of foul blot. So there is this sense, this understanding at the time in Britain and in the history of people who have anything to do as antique as being something a little bit laughable. And, in a sense that looking at the past is nothing new and nothing that modern science has invented. The way that we are doing all of this is obviously a little bit less judgy than what is pointed out here, but there is this a very clear distinction that becomes more apparent in the 15th, 16th century when this book is written, to separate the things of value, historical value, scientific value, from the funny stuff, the curiosities, if you will. And somebody who was interested in antiques at the time would have been the kind of person who is interested in novelties, in weird stuff. You know, you could perhaps call that something of a nerd, or, you know, somebody with a very specific interest in a very specific domain. And like I said, there is no form of archaeology the way that we understand it today. Most of our science, as we know it, becomes knowledgeable as far as the 19th century. And so this thing, this the study of people, of ancient history, if you will, it becomes a matter of what people call antiquary. Now, this different definition, but from almost contemporary of Francis Bacon, tells us about the antiquaries. He is a man strangely thrifty of time past, and an enemy indeed to his maw, whence he fetches out many things when they are now all rotten and stinking. He is one that has a natural disease to be enamored of old age and wrinkles, and loves all things, as Dutchmen do cheese, the better for being moldy and worm-eaten. He is of our religion because we say that he is most ancient, and yet a broken statue would almost make him an idolater. A great admirer he is of the old and rust of old monuments, and reads only those characters where time has eaten out the letters. He will go you 40 miles to see a saint's well or ruined abbey, and there but be a cross of a footstool, blah, 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 blah. There are people who are laughed at for looking at these laughable things, the antiques that we just mentioned, and people who are looking for these weird, odd, stinky old pieces of history are very much judged for that matter. Again, there is this sense that this is not particularly valuable science, nothing that people are you know, should be interested in this context. You know, this is obviously a satire or slightly humorous version of science. This is designed to make fun. This is not mean-spirited, although it's obviously comes off as rather mean-spirited in this. But we have also this discovery of the past that happens through these objects, and there is some value to finding these objects, however unscientific the story is, and it comes in the form of the particular groups that become involved here, such as this charter that is established in the 18th century for a society of antiquaries of London. Antiquaries as the people who study these antiques, because these are the objects that are valuable. These are the objects that are part of ancient British history, and more and more people are seeing that these things are worthy maybe of some study. And this particular, so the charter here, Royal Charter, says that this society is for the encouragement, advancement, and furtherance of the study and knowledge of the antiquities and history of this and other countries. So in the 18th century, there is some support for this this new science, this new version of our world that we will call antiquarianism. People who are interested in antiquaries. Now, in the United States, antiquaries are a slightly different matter, mostly because there are indigenous people, as we have pointed out, and the indigenous people are the subject of scientific study as a whole. And of course, looking into the past of the Americans would be looking into the past of the British. So therefore, there is this connection or lack of connection between these two worlds that is happening at the time. So in America, the world of antiquarianism is based on a slightly different value judgments than what's happening in Britain at the time. This letter right here is telling us of the beginnings of antiquarian study in the United States um, in the same area or the same time frame as what we have seen before in the previous couple of days. Sir, I have the honor to enclose the residue of the synopsis, hey, another synopsis, of the Indian tribes of North America classed in families according to their respective languages. My first attempt was made in the year 1823 at the request of a distinguished friend, Baron Alexander Humboldt. It was that essay communicated, it seems, to Mr. Bowlby and quoted by him with more praise than it deserved in the introduction of his Atlas Ethnographique, which drew the attention of the Antiquarian Society and induced it to ask me for a copy. It had not kept any, but in the meanwhile collected and obtained access to many important materials. In the winter of 1825 to 26, the attendance at Washington of a numerous delegation of Southern Indians enabled me to obtain good vocabularies of the Muskogee, Yuchi, Natchez, Chickasaw, and Cherokee, and I then published a table of all the existing tribes of the United States, which in its arrangement does not materially differ from that now adopted. So we have people who, under the name of antiquarianism and antiquarian societies, are looking for objects that are more or less curious about the folk cultures of America at the time, and they include the same objects that you would find in ethnology at the time, and eventually in anthropology. And so little by little, this discipline, as we're going to call it, of antiquarianism becomes a little bit rehabilitated in the sense that there is this understanding that however moldy and stinky those old objects are, if properly excavated, if properly taken care of within the sense of modern science, they can be valuable. Nietzsche, a important philosopher, of course, but especially a philosopher of history, does make a difference between the value of antiques as an object and the value of antiques as a scientific object. The fact that living requires the services of history must be understood just as clearly as the principle, which will be demonstrated later, that an excess of history harms the living person. In three respects, history belongs to a living person. It belongs to him as an active and striving person. It belongs to him as a person who preserves and reveres. It belongs to him as a suffering person in need of emancipation. This trinity of relationships corresponds to a trinity of methods for history to the extent that one may make the distinctions a monumental method, an antiquarian method, and a critical method. So the antiquary, the person who is interested in those objects of the past, and again, those could be languages as much as they could be objects, as much as they could be languages, become part of the research of history. Although, very generally speaking, the historian would be more interested in creating that narrative, kind of threading the different objects together, whereas the antiquarian would be more interested in gathering the objects as a record and kind of outside of their context. And this is why Nietzsche kind of proposes that you connect these different forms of historical research, and that if you could put these objects into that historical narrative the same way that historians typically do, then it would become necessarily a more valuable form of science. Thus, antiquarian history hinders the powerful willing of new things. It cripples the active man who always, as an active person, will and must set aside reverence to some extent. The fact that something has become old now gives birth to the demand that it must be immortal, for when a person reckons what every such ancient fact, an old custom, his father's religious belief, and inherited political right, has undergone throughout its existence, what a sum of reverence and admiration from individuals and generations ever since, then it seems presumptuous or even criminal to replace such an antiquity with something new and to set it up in a position to such numerous of revered, cluster of revered and admired things, the single fact of what is coming into being and what is present. So, of course, Nietzsche warns against being bogged down in these objects, and especially in the objects as they are disconnected from their context. And Nietzsche, writing after the Age of Enlightenment, or perhaps during the Age of Enlightenment in some respects, kind of comes to this new understanding of how science is working, and kind of putting out a different view of how science should be done. And certainly in this context, discarding certain things does not seem available, especially if it is an ancient thing that could be withering away pretty quickly. So Nietzsche points out that there is a value in these ancient objects, and there is a value, especially for our history in this context. But this is a matter of paying attention to all of the details much more than the objects themselves. So the discipline or the practice of antiquarianism kind of disappeared and faded back into the context, but it remains kind of synonymous with this not quite scientific or quasi-scientific, perhaps, study of the past. And you will see every now and then those words coming back to us. And here's an instance, for example, of the Vermont Antiquarian Booksellers Association. If you are interested in book currently in Vermont, you may find yourself in two old books, and the Booksellers Association will give you this opportunity to find these antiquarian books. Now, whatever value judgment you might attach to that, this seems like a good point to find these, folk tales that we have talked about, these kind of forgotten stories of the past in these old books. And perhaps this is the kind of resource that you could use for these, strange times that have happened in the past. For example, the giants of Britain, maybe some other kinds of characters that we are going to see in the coming weeks